PTF and JK back with you, Breeders' Cup 2024. We've got the pre-entries now, which means it's time for our video where we give you at least 3 thoughts. That's at least 3 thoughts on every Breeders' Cup race. Of course, we're going to have a ton more coverage. Make sure you subscribe to the In the Money Media YouTube channel where we'll have exclusive content. You're also going to want to check out our podcasts. If you subscribe to the In the Money Players podcast, wherever you get your pods. And if you want absolutely everything, subscribe to In the Money Plus. That's where we're going to have our extra trip notes and figure equivalencies for foreign horses and all that kind of fun jazz. InTheMoneyPodcast.com/plus. With that bit of business out of the way, JK, let's start off with some thoughts on the race that kicks things off for the Breeders' Cup. 5:45 is the scheduled post time Eastern for the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf Sprint. Give me a thought.
Yeah, look, I think that the Americans have typically had a stronghold on this race, until recently, it seems, in the last few years. But it feels like that, and Governor Sam and Jet Sweep Joe, more of a long shot type, Governor Sam, a much more predictable one with George Weaver, I think kind of give the Americans the best shot. There's typically you'd hear about a Wesley Ward runner who went over to Ascot and is an exciting one, but we don't seem to have that this year. So we'll see. I think Governor Sam, Jet Sweep Joe look to be the ones that can kind of create the most options for the Americans, but it sounds as if the Europeans and others internationally are going to bring some runners.
No doubt. A lot of the top of the market is going to go to foreign horses in here. We're going to have figure equivalents on the plus side, but I can just give you a sneak preview and tell you that they're pretty tightly clustered and hard to separate. My first thought will be about the Europeans. Big Mojo goes for the same connections as Big Ev. So maybe that gives them a little bit of an edge, like knowing what it takes to win this race. As you indicated, foreign horses have won the last 2. But here's the thing. Big Mojo's figures very similar to what other Euros are running. And then my third thought is, let's not forget about Japan. Ekoro Sig, very interesting. This horse actually might have the best figure of any of the horses running in this race. My immediate concern is he's been running over 6. This is the flat 5. I know he has gate speed. I know they say he's going to love the 5, but when I look down and see the form and it says 6, and a lot of people are going to assume that automatically translates. We know with these turf sprints, JK, sometimes that difference between 6 and 5 can be very significant.
Absolutely. And it's a sharp 5 too on firm ground. So I think that the setup of the race being at Del Mar, being the flat 5, being firm turf, make the race a little bit more different, at least for the Europeans.
We move next to the juvenile fillies, and we'll stick with the Japanese angle, talking about American Bikini. Of the figures that I fully trust, and we'll get into that statement in thought number 3, but of the figures that I fully trust, American Bikini has the best one. We've seen Japan win races at Del Mar Breeders' Cups before. She's one, folks, you definitely want to be looking into in the juvenile fillies.
Yeah, this feels like one of those situations where there could be an opportunity for a price horse. Like usually we have some sort of Bob Baffert runner, Chad Brown, Todd Pletcher trained, Brad Cox trained monster out there that has really fast numbers, and everyone else is just kind of hoping they don't show up. We don't really have that this year. Obviously, Immersive's been pretty consistent, but hasn't been running numbers that are going to wow you. So I think this is an opportunity, at least early on Friday, to get your first price of these 14 Breeders' Cup Championship races.
Yeah, I like that idea. And you make a good point about Immersive. The form is there, but on figures, nothing dominant. And maybe this is one where we can open it up to a long shot. We're going to post a video next Tuesday where once we have post positions, etc., we're going to go through and put out some long shots that you're going to potentially want to be betting. I have a feeling we'll have at least one for this juvenile fillies. My other thought, and it's almost a question for you, JK, how much do we really want to trust the buyer figure that Scottish Lassie earned in the Frisette of 90? I mean, she was just a maiden, dominating a bad field with an easy trip. It looked good, but I don't know, man. I don't think I want to bet that figure as if it's really a 90, and she's going to cut out a lot of the market. Quick thought on Scottish Lassie before we pivot.
Well, I think the thing that you do want to take into consideration on days like that she ran, Scottish Lassie ran, is that you are going to have other comparative races, right? The Frisette run at that 1 turn mile at Belmont or Aqueduct And on that same day, you had a horse like Chancer McPatrick run in a similar distance, same distance, a mile distance. I think it's a little bit easier to trust when you have established form and similar races to compare to. I think that whatever the figure is probably what it is, but I'm still not sure that's going to match what her price will be.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Let's go to the Juvenile Fillies Turf. Start us off with one of your thoughts.
Yeah, the Juvenile Fillies Turf is one where it's pretty shocking to me that there's not some dominant Chad Brown runner in this race that you can lean on. I think that's the most important thought that I had is where's Chad in this race outside of Virgin Colada, but she's not been necessarily dominant. And I'll kind of tie that in with who did win that race the Virgin Colada was in, which was Scythian, who ran well in that spot for Bill Mott. And Bill Mott's found his little knack of getting these horses and not caring what sex they are, running them where they can actually run on the grass, which he did last time as well with last year with Galibrand. So it's kind of a combination of where's Chad's monster in here. And I think Scythian ran pretty well in that race down at Belmont at Aqueduct.
In the history of this race, it's been a bit of a story of Chad Brown versus Aidan O'Brien. And Aidan O'Brien brings his strongest hand yet. Lake Victoria has the best form of any filly to run in this race. She's got a big speed figure edge. She's going to be about 4 to 5 in here, JK. I think she probably gets the job done as far as this one goes. Did you have another thought on this one, or are we going to sort of call your 2-1 and mine the third and move on?
No, I will say this. There is one horse that I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about as we get a little bit deeper into the streets when it comes to long shots. But one that has my attention, at least initially, is Destino d'Oro for Brad Cox. I thought she ran sensational in defeat after a horrible trip. And I know there's no bad trips in slow races, but I will say that the exception is, in my opinion, these 2-year-old turf races. I think the figures are very hard to make. A lot of times with older horses, you can compare with other horses and understand what they ran last time to find a way to get the science to make sense when it comes to a figure. But when you don't have a lot of form, it's hard to make slow races fast. I think Destino d'Oro is interesting if Lake Victoria can stub her toe in the nice way, not the mean way.
Yeah, I get you. Juvenile's up next. Kick us off.
Yeah, in the Juvenile, to me, this is really about Chancer versus East Avenue. Chancer McPatrick, East Avenue, the two horses that have kind of shown up and shown out and so far in terms of what East did at Keeneland and what Chancer's done up in New York and the 2 grade ones that he has. But that's my 1A thought. My 1B thought is that those 2 horses have beat the same horse who's run second to them, and that's Ferocious, who I still believe somewhere in there is Brilliance. And if those 2 are the best 2 and he's run second to them twice, maybe he's just right behind him. Ferocious feels a little bit like Fierceness 2.0, had the Brilliance in the summer, kind of faltered a little bit, and then showed up and ran off the screen in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile. Ferocious will not beat me in this race.
Very interesting idea there. I'll mention one that I thought you were going to do just as a hunch play. The third one I'd bring into the mix, your namesake, Jonathan's Way. What's this horse done wrong? I mean, I know we're dealing with going from a 1-turn mile out to the 2 turns, but to me, I mean, I think Ferocious has proved that he's not as good as those top 2. I'd say it's got to be one of those top 2 or Jonathan's Way in this spot. I just think those 3 seem like they're head and shoulders above the rest of the division. What kind of count do you give Jonathan's Way?
No, I think that he's the other one. I had mentioned East Avenue and Chancer McPatrick, who will top the market. Ferocious is the interesting one, who I think could be a little forgotten, very similar to the name that you've probably confused him with, Fierceness. And Jonathan's Way make a lot of sense. I think the other and kind of third and final thought about this Juvenile, and I don't have a lot to add on it, is where are the California horses? There's usually one that jumps out as a possibility to do something special. I don't really see that horse this year.
I guess my one thing on Ferocious, and we'll talk about this more in other videos, is I stuck on the idea that first race that was so good was in the mud. But we'll talk about him more on other videos. It's an interesting running of the Juvenile. Big clash between those 2 to 3 at the top of the market, and JK trying to pull in an interesting one in Ferocious. The first day ends with the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf, JK. And this is one where I know you've got a thought of a horse that you really want to see run here, who may or may not run here. What are you hearing about your friend Mentee?
Yeah, it showed up in the entries that he's first preference for this race. So I'm excited to see what he can do. These City of Lights have been absolutely sensational. They had another winner last weekend with a horse called Uncle Jim. They've obviously got what's likely to be the favorite or the second choice in the Breeders' Cup Classic and Fierceness. They've got 2-year-old champions, City of Light. He wins on grass. He wins everywhere. And I'm excited to see Mentee. I don't have any issue with Mentee stretching out. Mentee's shown a bunch of turn of foot, being able to sprint, and I'm looking forward to seeing this one in here. I think Mentee's in the right spot.
The Europeans have a phrase that I don't know that how fully it translates, but I think from when I say it, I think you'll know what it means. Do you have an idea what it means when I say a much of a muchness about them? This group of Europeans has a much of a muchness about them. Does that make sense to you intuitively?
Kind of. I see where you're coming from.
They're all kind of the same.
Yeah.
Of the first time Europeans, I just don't at this stage have a lot to separate. I'm going to definitely be consulting with Rob Dove, one of the top 10 pro punters in the UK today. We're going to have his figure conversions and analysis behind our paywall over at In the Money Plus, inthemoneypodcast.com/plus. So I reserve the right to maybe pivot onto one of them, but I'm going to let you talk about the one who started over there, who last ran here, who looks like the clear leader to me in this division heading in, and that's New Century.
Well, yeah, and we talk about how hard it is to make 2-year-old figures fast. It's hard because the paces can sometimes be a little bit slower, so the final times can be affected, and you don't have other numbers really to pull from to make a number fast. New Century did get a fast number. I think New Century is the best horse in this race that has run in America, and I'm excited about an opportunity for Qatar Racing and New Century to run extremely well. It's not too often that I like two horses whose last races were in this country and this race.
Yeah, it's interesting and definitely a race we'll be diving more into. Make sure you especially check out our Final Answer show. That's going to be live streaming on Wednesday of Breeders' Cup Week, 7:45 Eastern. Again, if you subscribe to the In the Money Media YouTube channel, you'll get a notification about it. If you click that little bell, I recommend doing that. But that show will be available on demand as well as we pivot to Saturday, where we kick off with the Turf Sprint, going to be one of the biggest favorites of the weekend here. There was a stat on Twitter, which is, we used to play a game on the show called Good Stat, Bad Stat. And the idea was, how much, and good or bad just meant, a stat is a stat, right? But the idea was, how much signal does it have going forward? Spoiler alert, I think this stat has zero signal going forward, but it was fascinating. So I will give credit to Ed DeRosa, who, in a rare good moment on Twitter, love Ed in real life, not always on Twitter, but in a fascinating tweet that he sent out, JK, he noted that horses who've made any start at Kentucky Downs the same year as they contested the Breeders' Cup are 0 for 101 since 2014. That stat, of course, applies to Cogburn.
Yeah, but you know what I'd like to see. There's no stat for me there. I understand the point. I think a lot of times what happens though is a lot of those horses have been pointed to some of the longer turf races. A lot of the money chasing, and I think that it's just a different ball game. The kind of horse that wins a race at Kentucky Downs feels like a different type of horse that wins a race at a Breeders' Cup. If it's a stamina thing, if it turns into a stamina race, then the ones from overseas usually do it better. I get it, but I'm not going to let it influence my decisions about Cogburn. I think he's the shortest price that we'll see all weekend.
And you think he's nailed on?
I do. I think he is. And that leads me to my other thought of the race is, Star of Mystery had some moments of brilliance as a 3-year-old filly. Maybe, just maybe, she could continue to improve, and with the right setup, she could come running in there. But I think Cogburn's an absolute freak.
I do think he's a freak. I think he's the best U.S. turf sprinter of all time. I don't think that stat matters because, for one thing, Cogburn wasn't even necessarily going to run in that race. Remember, he missed his race because it got rained out at Saratoga. There is a logic to, over the years, Kentucky Downs not being a good pointer to Breeders' Cup, but also they've just started to get graded stakes. The last 3 years at Kentucky Downs are totally different than everything that came before it. It's a fascinating number. It means nothing in terms of Cogburn. But here's the bad news for Cogburn. This is really Cogburn, clearly the best of the Americans, but this European group is strong, JK. What if I told you, sneak preview, I mentioned Rob Dove, one of the top 10 pro punters in the UK today earlier, sneak preview of his figure equivalencies. What if I told you that Bradsell is just as fast as Cogburn, translated to the buyer scale? And we're talking speed figures and form figures. This horse is superb and going to give him a real race. And there are still questions. Bradsell's never run around a bend. So that's a key question we're going to be paying attention to. We've got Vanessa Ryle, Michael Adolphson on the grounds at Breeders' Cup. They're going to be with the Europeans. We're going to do a lot more digging. If you follow along all our coverage, you'll see what our latest thoughts are as we get closer to the Breeders' Cup. But don't sleep on him. And then just one other quick thought, Big Ev's trying to make it back-to-back. We just did our back-to-back video at the Breeders' Cup, which you can find on Breeders' Cup YouTube channel. Big Ev's trying to do that. Last year, he ran to the exact figure predicted by Dove in his analysis. But this year, he's only the third or fourth fastest Euro in this race. So Cogburn versus the Euros, it's going to be fun to see how it plays out. Let's get to the filly and mare sprint.
Yeah, look, this is my first thought here is Chad Brown is a dirt trainer. Chad, I think, will win his, and I say that facetiously for people who think that he can only train a turf horse. Listen to this stat. Chad's won, I think he's won the last two, but he'll win, in my opinion, his third filly and mare sprint in a row. Pretty impressive. And in the meantime, he's won 5 of the last 9 Champagnes, one of the most prestigious 2-year-old dirt races in this country. My first thought is Chad's a dirt trainer.
I love it. Ways and means, I think she's one of the most interesting betting options of the weekend because, yeah, she's going to be the favorite, but there are some other interesting runners in here to the point where I think she's going to be a bettable favorite. And obviously you can pick up equity still singling Lake Victoria at 4-5 or whatever, but you're way better off singling horse that's going to, I mean, what, doesn't she almost have to be 5-2 in this spot, at least 2-1 with the other options? And that's a real opportunity to juice your horizontal payouts and find value. So my main thought on this race, I think she's going to be very reliable at a very bettable price here.
Yeah, my last thought is a little bit tricky, is that these other horses in here have had some wow moments throughout the year. Society, Stilla, Vava. But the problem is that Ways and Means has been consistently wowish. And she's had that since getting back around one turn. But it always in the back of your head makes you a little bit nervous because if one of those show up with their A race, they can beat her. It's just whether or not she's going to show up with her A or A plus race.
Yeah, I'm not saying she's a certainty. I just think she's going to be good value because of that consistency. Obviously, you know, if you have strong opinions elsewhere, I'm not going to complain if anybody wants to include any of those others. Let's get to the filly and mare turf, and Europe looms really large in this race, JK. The problem is there's not a ton of consistency from these European types. I mean, Emily Upjohn, the form really stacks up. She's going back in the right direction. She has that paper that looks like a filly and mare turf narrative. There's also a cool story here with the jockey Schumark, who there's been some pressure on connections to replace, and they've stuck with him. And what a good end of season story it would be to see him in a Breeders' Cup winner circle. She's high on the list here, cross-entered in the turf, but I think she'll go here. Another cross-entered in the turf, I'll give you my second thought with, that is Content. This one, we've got to see what we think about where she is in her form cycle. If she can rebound going left-handed on good ground, as opposed to, you know, not going left-handed on soft ground. This is another one. I can't wait to talk to Vanessa and Michael in the pods and videos we're going to have Breeders' Cup week. Very much on my radar. You have a thought on this filly and mare turf to round us out?
Yeah, I think the first one is, where's Chad? Pretty shocking that Chad doesn't have one in here. And I've seen some articles about him not really necessarily loving the distance. So maybe this is a bit of a boycott on his part. The other thought, I suppose, is that I thought Soprano ran into a little bit of a buzzsaw last time. And I think that it is one that could maybe appreciate a little bit more ground, maybe some firmer ground on the West Coast. There's an opportunity, I think, for the tables to kind of get turned a little bit there. with the way that Soprano ran last time.
Next up, believe it or not, Breeders' Cup Classic with the TV deal that NBC have with the Big Ten, the way the broadcast windows work. This race is going to be in the middle of the card, almost like European style, the way they run, the arc in the middle of the arc day card. What do you think of the new positioning of this race?
Look, I think you got to do what you got to do. I think it's not ideal, obviously, but I think the Breeders' Cup would tell you it's not ideal. But it's a situation. If you're coming from a situation, a network that when we have to sometimes bounce around on FS1 and FS2, there's a positive to having your biggest race on national television. And if you have to adjust the times from time to time, so be it.
Yeah, you've seen firsthand how that affects how many eyeballs can get on something. Here's my prediction. I don't know how bold it is. A 3-year-old will win this year's Breeders' Cup Classic. Of course, that leaves a whole lot of horses in the mix, including Fierceness, even Sierra Leone, and of course, the big invaders. City of Troy just wrote a piece for attheraces.com, which we'll send out in our free In the Money Media newsletter, inthemoneypodcast.com/email, talking to a bunch of experts about whether or not City of Troy will handle the dirt. And some will say, how could you mention 3 other horses before you mention Forever Young, who many thought could have won the Kentucky Derby with a clean run through and came back with a very big figure, as you'll see with our figure equivalencies on the In the Money Plus side in his return race in Japan. I think it's a 3-year-old that's going to do it. Not exactly sure which one yet.
It's funny, the implied probability based on the closing odds of the 3-year-olds, I would say that the 3-year-old's chances of winning this race is going to be like 85%.
I'll take the under, but only a little. Only a little.
I mean, but if you think about it, Forever Young, City of Troy, Fierceness, Sierra Leone, who else? I mean, it's going to be a tight one, but I agree. It's not too often that happens. I think that my first thought about this race is that I think more than any race that I'll look at, the one that matters the most when they draw on Monday, and we'll have lots of coverage right after the draw, the day after, and leading up to the draw. So make sure you check out the YouTube channel. The draw matters more in this race than any other race. I think where Fierceness draws is very important. I think where City of Troy draws is very important. And I think that if I could only watch the draw live for one of these races, it would definitely be this one.
We are going to be doing a live stream actually with Breeders' Cup and Del Mar. It'll broadcast on the In the Money channel as well, reacting to the draw. If you can't join us live for that, send me any thoughts you have. But I'm with you. I think basically, I think if you're Fierceness or your City of Troy, you don't want to be way drawn down on the inside. Is that the main thing you're looking for?
Yeah, I mean, Fierceness. I think Fierceness is I think Todd and Johnny would say the further out the better.
Yeah,
like we got a long run of the first turn. Let me be clear here. Let me have this whole straightaway to find some position to get him comfortable. I think with City of Troy, I think with that same idea, with that long run, and one of the main questions being kickback, why want to be drawn down to the inside, and then Sierra Leone, I think that people will be paying attention a little bit with that draw as well. So I think there's a lot to be said.
Him, I wouldn't mind being down inside. The other thing with City of Troy is that 50%, 80%, somewhere between there of Aidan O'Brien horses break slow. If City of Troy is down inside and breaks slow, it's game over, folks. And he's going to be one of the favorites. So definitely a draw worth paying attention to. A lot more on that one. Fierceness bidding to become another back-to-back winner. And actually, believe it or not, JK, the first 2-year-old champ, the first juvenile champ to win the Classic he would be, which is amazing. I didn't realize that, but I saw that stat in some notes somewhere. Let's get on to the turf. We'll let you kick off with this one.
Yeah, I mean, this is the weakest American contingency we've had, even in the years, it feels like the Europeans have kind of dominated us in turf racing, which I think the playing field is much more level now. We just don't have one. And that's no offense to Farbridge, who's a multiple grade 1 winner this year. But he doesn't really inspire a lot of confidence that he's going to be able to overcome anything of any value that they send over from overseas. So that was my first thought, the weakest American contingency we've ever had.
And the European contingency is interesting. There's certainly horses on their best day, whether it's, Luxembourg, certainly Rebels Romance, who's won this race before. Another one I'll help people with the pronunciation. It's not hard at all, actually. JRB is how they call that horse. That looks like you could say all manner of things about. But, looking at JRB's top form figures, they're kind of right there with Luxembourg and Rebels Romance. So trying to separate this European contingency, that's something we're going to do as we get further down the line. But I would agree with you, JK. This looks like one that is probably supposed to go to Europe. And then, my other thought would just be that Rebels Romance really does have a great shot to be the latest two-time turf winner. We've had a few of them over the years, and this is a horse that what we know about him that we don't know about the others is he likes this configuration of racing. Let's get to the heavyweight fight, shall we? The Distaff. Boy, this one shapes up to be just such an intense clash between Torpedo Anna and returning champion Idiomatic. Give me a thought.
I got a thought, Pete. My monster pod for this one going to be very, very good. It's a surprise. It's on it's somewhere else on the channel. You'll see it. It's a very, very good one. That's my first thought, and it's so good it was worth teasing it.
I love it. I love that. I will say this. Right now in the international markets, Idiomatic seems very overpriced compared to Torpedo Anna. Right now in those markets, we're talking about even money versus 3-1. I'm not 100% sure Idiomatic. I know the public will make Torpedo the favorite, but if I'm just like, if God came down from Mount Olympus or whatever and told you what price these horses should be, I'm not sure Idiomatic shouldn't be favored over Torpedo Anna. Is that crazy?
Based on figures and accomplishments, I would think that's the case. I mean, outside of one race that Torpedo Anna's run in her career, Idiomatic would definitely be the favorite. If it wasn't for that Travers performance and that Travers number, I think even with the fanfare behind Torpedo Anna, Idiomatic's consistency, and the fact that she's a champion from this race last year, I think that she would probably be there. So look, I think this race reminds me that one of my thoughts of this race, and the obvious thoughts is obviously, with Torpedo Anna, the Delaware or Travers Torpedo Anna, which one shows up? Idiomatic, the one that showed up last time, or the one that we kind of saw all year, the inconsistent one. I think that's the first thought that I had. But the second thought was that, if they both show up, this feels like a remix of Beholder and Songbird. Now, Idiomatic was never as brilliant as Beholder. I'm not trying to compare her in that way, but she is she's won the race before. She's an older horse who's very accomplished, champion, facing the kind of dominant 3-year-old superstar who's growing up. And I'm just hopeful that they both show up and they look each other in the eye, just like Beholder and Songbird did all the way down the stretch.
Bonus thoughts on this one, just because it's such an interesting race. I think the key to the race is, for me, in terms of how I'm going to play it, how much do we buy the Ken McPeak narrative about she was undertrained for the race at Parks? He thought she'd win it on her own. And he basically said, going there off half-baked preparation, don't worry about that. What you're going to see with the full-baked preparation for the Breeders' Cup is the improved version of what we saw in the Travers. If he's right, if that narrative's true, then the prices in the international markets are actually correct, and she probably is better than Idiomatic. So that's a question you have to ask yourself. How much do you buy that McPeak narrative? And I know you had one other thought. I assume you were talking about the Breeders' Cup betting challenge and what will happen if one of these big two does not win.
No, I'm just saying in general, if one of these two horses doesn't win, I give up. I think that I don't think this is a spot that I will be wasting any equity on upsets.
Breeders' Cup Sprint is up next. This is an interesting one. We haven't talked about this, but we were talking off air about domestic product. And just reading between the lines of quotes, I know this is listed as the second preference for domestic product, but I got the idea there was at least some chance he might go here. You have an ear to the ground. Which race do you think domestic product is going to run in?
No, I mean, I would imagine that Chad's torn on what to do. I would like to see him run in this spot. And I think that the reason I feel passionate about that is because of what we saw in this race last year, which was a lesson that Elite Power taught me, which is that a closer going 7 can sometimes be better going 6. They're going to get more pace to close into, and they're going to have a more intense kick going that little bit of a shorter distance. And I think Domestic Product would be rolling down the middle of the track in a race that's full of speed. And I think it's really interesting to see what's going to happen. So that's my first thought. I wish he was in this spot. It's also a little bit of my dirt miles thought too. I wish he was running in this spot, and I think he can win the dirt mile as well. But I think it's the Californian horses. I think Raging Torrent was one who caught my attention earlier this year as a 3-year-old, who I thought would continue to improve as the year went on, and he's doing so. And I think that he's one that really has my attention. The East Coast sprinters haven't really grabbed me by the soul. Nakatomi, I think, is one of those horses that could take advantage of a pace-filled race. But Raging Torrent, Nakatomi, all very interesting to me so far.
This is a race that's complexion completely changed with the notion or the event of Chosen Braun getting on the vets list out in California. He was a horse in one of our other videos. I already talked about liking this for him as a home game with his combination of speed and class. He won't be running. So I'm rethinking where I'm at with this race. But I will say this, JK, for my last thought on this race. I'm not just the host of the In the Money Players podcast. I'm also a listener. And I thought it was really interesting when you were talking about Nakatomi before that last race, saying you really thought that was more of a prep. And no matter what happened there, he'd be seen to better effect, maybe his best effect, come Breeders' Cup Sprint. Coupling that idea with the setup that you reference, he's certainly one that's going to be on some tickets for me. Anything else on the Sprint?
No, I think you're right. With an older horse, why have him fully cranked up for a race that doesn't matter at Keeneland as a prep? I think that it was probably part of Wesley's plan to send him over there at 70%, 75, 80%, which would then push him to 95, and then they could tighten the screws a couple weeks leading up to get him to 100%. I think that's probably exactly what happened.
My first thought on the Breeders' Cup Mile, this is a stronger group of Europeans than I was expecting. This was a race where I was thinking it was maybe open to some of these American runners, but looking at these Euros, I think it might be the European story again. And just for a sort of a piggyback thought onto that, just because Porta Fortuna, who I really do love and is very likable filly, but just because she's beaten Ramatuelle twice, I'm not sure that Ramatuelle might not be the one who's a little bit better suited to American racing and might be able to turn the tables on her. Look, I'm going to sort of give you these two thoughts and leave it with you here, JK, but I will also just add the idea that this is a very hard race to do much with before we get the draw and see exactly who's going to be here and what the posts look like and design these races in our head. So I'll just say much more to come on the Breeders' Cup Mile as we get closer, from me, from Dove, from Vanessa, from Michael, from the team in general on this Breeders' Cup Mile. But I know you have a soft spot for a couple of these USA runners.
Yeah, I got 3 thoughts, and we'll have plenty of time to elaborate on them, and I'll just kind of pop them out here quick. The last 6 winners of this race were all bred in either Ireland or Great Britain. Carl Sprackler was bred in Ireland as well. There's never can I remember really that like one of these dominant California horses wins this race. It just doesn't happen. Whether it's the East Coast or the Far East, they always seem to get a little bit overmatched. That's something that got my attention about Johannes. And then I think there's more to the eye than meets more than looks. More Than Looks has had a little bit of a tricky campaign, was kind of campaigned towards the back side of the year. That rain got rained off, was supposed to run in the Lure, ended up running in the 4-star Dave, broke slowly, came running late. Same situation for the Coolmore Mile, broke a little slow, came running late. Maybe, just maybe, More Than Looks can kind of get it all sorted out of here. Those are my 3 thoughts about this Breeders' Cup Mile.
All right, now that this horse is retired, Cody's Wish, I'm trying to show him here if you can see him there in the screen. I think that's a decent view. Now that he's retired, can I go back to complaining about the Dirt Mile again as a race that takes away from 2 other more important Breeders' Cup races, the Sprint and the Classic? I know this genie doesn't fit back in the bottle, but I just thought I'd get some kvetching in and a cool chance to show off my doll. Let's talk about who's going to win this year's Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile, though, JK, especially in this all-important position as the anchor leg for a lot of these bets on day 2, including the Pick 6, including the Breeders' Cup Betting Challenge.
Yeah, I mean, my first thought is that because people like to poke at me, all of my racehorse fans, look, Seize the Gray is an opportunistic horse. And when the opportunity is perfect for him, he can win some big races. He's not going to have a perfect setup here. He's going to have to deal with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 horses that are faster than him early. I don't need Seize the Gray in this spot. I can let you know that all right off of the rip. And then look, I'm not going to give up on these Baffords. This is like what they do. These mild dirt races is kind of in their wheelhouse. They're trained that way. They're bred that way. A lot of their careers are targeted around races like this. So I'm not going to give up on Muth and National Treasure, despite the fact that they haven't run particularly well in their last couple starts.
Good stuff. We're going to have so much more on the Breeders' Cup. Best way to get all our information in the moneypodcast.com/plus, trip notes, horse by horse write-ups of every race. But if you don't want to do that and you just want to check us out on YouTube and listen to the podcast, you'll have plenty of great information as well. For JK, I'm PTF. May you win all your Breeders' Cup photos.